Welcome to the Lens of History. You are with Luke Herbert, speaking with special guests and placing the microscope on current and historical events.
In this latest installment of the Lens of History program that first aired on a now defunct podcast, I speak with Dave Steward, and as the listener will hear, he has a lot to say about South Africa's constitution and the post-apartheid era that is since 1994 and what has taken place in South Africa in that time period. We now join Luke Herbert and Dave in the Lens of History studio.
Today I have a very interesting guest who I'm sure will have a lot to say on current events in South Africa from the point of view of the FW de Klerk Foundation. So I am now joined by Dave Steward. How are you today?
Pretty good, thanks.
Well, I'm glad to hear that you're doing well, and thank you very much for joining us. And just so we get started, can you introduce yourself and the foundation to the listener?
Yeah, my name is Dave Steward. I am the Executive Director of the FW de Klerk Foundation, which FW de Klerk and I established in 1999. Earlier on, I was the Director General in his office during the transition from the previous government to the government of Nelson Mandela. Before that, I was the head of our South African Communication Agency, and before that, I was a diplomat.
That is an interesting lot of experiences you've had there. But just so we can get some background for the listener, can you give the listener some idea of what poverty means and is like in South Africa? Because, you know, it's possible in, say, first world countries or developed countries, depending on terminology, that you can own a widescreen TV and still be considered poor. So I think this is a very important thing to frame for the listener.
We have different measures of poverty in South Africa, and most measures of poverty relate to a per capita income per day. And in terms of most of the measures, there is a high degree of poverty in South Africa. Around 30% of the population live beneath the poverty line. The good news is that is improving slightly, primarily because of social transfers. There are now 15 million South Africans who receive social transfers of one kind or another in the form of children's allowances or pensions or disability allowances. But this means that almost a third of our population are subsisting on government handouts.
All right, then, and just before we leave the topic of how you define poverty, I once heard the observation that in poorer parts of the world, that people strive to put some food on the table and a roof over their heads, and then they strive to put a better roof over their heads and more food on the table. Do you think that's a fair assessment of the poor in South Africa?
Yeah, I think that the basic needs, of course, are food and housing. There are very few people in South Africa who are, who don't have enough food to eat. There are few people now who don't have housing. One of the successes of the ANC government has been to build more than 3 million new houses for the poor since 1994. So it means that in our black population, we have a high percentage of home ownership as well. 75% of black South Africans own the homes in which they live. There is still too much informal housing. We still have 4 or 5 million people living in informal housing and shacks. We still have people living in traditional housing in the deep rural areas of the country, traditional huts and kraals and what have you.
All right, then we are going to change gears here quite a bit in terms of what we're discussing, but can you introduce the listener to the South African Constitution, its main articles, and just to give a sort of international perspective, how does it differ from the Constitution in the USA and the UK?
Well, our Constitution is really very important for us. It is the foundation of our new multicultural nation. It was negotiated by parties representing majorities from all of our communities. So there is substantial buy-in from South Africans across the spectrum. And it is an excellent constitution. It is a constitution based on the values of human dignity, equality, the enjoyment of rights for all South African citizens, non-racialism, non-sexism, the supremacy of the Constitution and the rule of law, and the establishment of a democratic state with competing parties, regular elections, and a government that is open, responsive, and accountable. Those are the core values of the Constitution. And it differs from the Constitution in the United States, perhaps not so much as it differs from the constitutional situation in the United Kingdom. Our Constitution is justiciable. That means that it is the supreme law of the land, and any conduct or any law that is inconsistent with the Constitution can be overturned by our courts. And this has happened quite regularly since 1994 and is the cause of growing tension between the government and the courts. Our Constitution differs from that of the United States in that the American Constitution is basically a federal constitution, which clearly defines and limits the powers of the federal government, although those limitations are being eroded, and makes extensive provision for the powers and rights of states. South Africa has a weak federal system in which we have 9 provinces, but the central government has much more power and influence in South Africa than it does in the United States. And then, of course, as far as the United Kingdom is concerned, the United Kingdom doesn't actually have a constitution. It is bound by a whole lot of constitutional conventions, which would probably be enforced by the courts. But in the United Kingdom, you still have the principle of parliamentary supremacy. So Parliament can theoretically adopt any law it likes. This is the system we used to have in South Africa before 1994, and it was abused. So we're very happy to have a situation that is much more closely regulated by the rule of law and by the courts.
Just on the history of the current constitution, it came about through the post-apartheid negotiations. Would that be a correct assessment?
That's right. The first thing that we did, well, very soon after Mr. de Klerk became president, was to announce all of the measures that were needed to break the historic and political logjam in South African politics and open the way to constitutional negotiations. The constitutional negotiations took about 3.5 years to complete, and they involved all parties with significant support in South Africa. They were, I think, ranging between 21 and 23 parties involved in the negotiations at any time, including the parties that had traditionally been struggling against apartheid, the African National Congress, the South African Communist Party, and others, and then the former governing party, the National Party, and the Liberal Democratic Alliance, which was then called the Democratic Party. So it meant that for for a period of 3.5 years, South Africans sat around a table and hammered out all of the components in our constitution, and there was a great deal of hard bargaining. But we emerged at the end of the day with a constitution that reflected the will of our very complex society.
Oh, well, I suspect in the future in New Zealand, while we have a different society, I think we are going to be having some of the discussions you guys had there, because I think, it wouldn't be that hard to find an opinion in New Zealand that there's too much executive or parliamentary power, but just, moving along. Some of the great work that the foundation does is to help educate poverty-stricken and impoverished children in South Africa. So what barriers exist to educating the poverty-stricken children, and what is the foundation doing to help the poverty-stricken and impoverished children?
Well, to start with, our main focus, in fact, is defending and protecting our Constitution, and that keeps us pretty busy. We do have a program that assists kids who have severe mental handicaps, particularly here in the Western Cape, or kids who have other handicaps. So we've channeled a few million rand to good organizations that are helping children in this category. But with regard to the challenges we face in education, that is another matter, and what we do there is lobby for better education policies, and we try to inform the public of the main issues relating to education. And the unhappy fact is that our education system has done very, very badly since 1994. Of the 1,050,000 kids who entered our education system in 2000, only about 380,000 emerged in 2011 with the school leaving certificate, which we call matric. But even those 380,000 were undereducated, because you can pass matric with 30% in 3 subjects and 40% in 3 other subjects. So it's only about 85 to 95,000 kids who passed matric with points sufficient to get into university who actually emerged from the education system with a basic, decent education. And that just simply isn't good enough. What are the causes of our educational dysfunctionality? I think that the ANC government, with the best intentions in the world, took some of the worst decisions you could possibly take relating to education. They closed down the teachers' training colleges because they weren't fancy enough. That we used to have teachers' training colleges that produced teachers primarily for primary school posts. That the ANC insisted that all teachers should have a 3-year academic degree plus a teacher's diploma, but what we needed were the basic primary school teachers. There was also a breakdown in discipline in the schools and among teachers due to the influence of the South African Democratic Teachers Union. According to a survey done last year by our Human Sciences Research Council, the average black teacher at black schools spends only 3.5 hours a day teaching, as compared with 6.5 hours a day in the integrated schools, which are really run by middle-class parents. So that is an enormous disadvantage for the kids involved. Another problem has been that many of the black kids in the rural areas have been taught in English during their primary school careers, which is a language that they don't understand and which the teachers don't speak very well. And it's been established that if you are not educated for the first 6 or 7 years of your school career in a language that you can understand, your mother tongue, you are almost doomed to educational failure further down the road. So these are all problems that have been identified, and to give the government credit, they acknowledge these problems and they are now introducing programs to address them. But the problem is that in the meantime, we've lost a generation of kids, and it'll take another generation before we can really repair the system.
Just before we leave the topic of education, how much is South Africa's high unemployment rate affecting the children who are living in poverty and their education?
Well, to a very great extent. There are a number of factors that cause poverty among children in South Africa. One of them is the high level of unemployment, which I shall return to in a moment. The other is the fact that only 28% of black kids have got two parents at home. This means that the whole responsibility of educating and sustaining the other 72% falls on the shoulders of our black women. And really that gives kids a huge handicap from the start. As far as unemployment is concerned, it is perhaps one of the biggest problems we face. The official unemployment rate is 25.3%, but this is only really the tip of the iceberg because it doesn't include 2 million people who have given up looking for jobs because they are discouraged. If these people are included, then the unemployment rate is closer to 35%. And among the black population, it is closer to 40%, which is unsustainable. It is particularly serious among black youth. So 73%, 74% of young black South Africans below the age of 30 are unemployed. And again, this is creating huge social tensions in South Africa.
This program is supported by 3 Feet Radio.
All right, then, you mentioned before that the Foundation's key role is to defend the South African Constitution. So this next question's rather blunt, to be honest, but what threats exist to the Constitution in its current form, and can it prevent South Africa from becoming a one-party state like Zimbabwe?
Well, our present Constitution does prevent South Africa from becoming a one-party state like Zimbabwe. But there are threats to the Constitution. The ruling party is clearly very frustrated with the role of the courts because it keeps on losing important court cases. And so it clearly wants to limit the power of the courts, particularly their power to review and overturn legislation that is unconstitutional or conduct that is unconstitutional. And if the government were ever to succeed with this goal of limiting the power of the courts, then it would have very serious implications for constitutional government in the future. But we are confident that civil society, media, which is free, will be able to hold the line on upholding the independence of our courts. There is also some talk in ruling party circles that the Constitution served its purpose during the last 18 years of transition, and now we must throw out some of the elements in the Constitution and perhaps bring in other elements in what is called a second transition. The ANC claims that the Constitution is standing in the way of social and economic transformation. But in our opinion, this is simply not the case. The problems with economic and social transformation have nothing to do with the Constitution, which actually calls for transformation. They have everything to do with the fact that government has adopted the wrong policies in these areas.
All right, yeah, I think the overall economic health probably falls outside. Sorry, I think probably the overall economic health of South Africa falls somewhat outside of the mandate of the foundation, and you can correct me if I'm wrong on that one. And you've referred to sort of multiculturalism or multicultural society in South Africa. So can you define multiculturalism from a South African point of view? And my curiosity is it the same thing as nationalism?
Well, it's not really the same as nationalism, because really pertains to a group that wishes to set up its own nation with its own right to self-determination. That I don't think is possible in South Africa. What we have is a vast variety of different communities in South Africa, each with its own identity, history, predilections, customs, and what have you. And for us, the big challenge is how these different communities should live together, coexist together in harmony, maintaining their own identities where they wish to do so, but all supporting an overarching loyalty to our constitution and to the emerging multicultural South African nation. So this, we think, is the challenge for our society, but not only for our society, for societies around the world, because there are very few countries now that do not have substantial minorities. I think more than 75% of countries in the world have minorities of more than 10% of their population. So everywhere in a world that is becoming more heterogeneous, the challenges are developing as to how relationships in societies, in multicultural societies, will be organized. This is particularly a question that is exercising many people in Europe now, with immigrant communities from the Middle East and other parts of the world. So it is, how do you manage relationships in countries with a variety of different cultures? And we believe that there are some very sound principles that can be followed that can promote harmony, such as respecting the rights of different communities to be able to use their languages, to educate their kids in the language of their choice, creating institutions that encourage cooperation between communities, creating an overarching set of values that really constitute the new multicultural national ethos. So basically, we think that this is a challenge that not only South Africa must face, but a large number of countries around the world must face, including, of course, New Zealand with your Maori minority.
Oh, absolutely. We've had this same sort of discussions here, and we still do. I mean, we did have the Treaty of Waitangi, which my Kiwi listeners will be familiar with, and the government has made payouts on that on the basis of the treaty that was signed back in about 1840. So I completely agree with you. And without digging too far into South Africa's past, do you think South Africa was the first country to really look at multiculturalism? And that's not to say that they necessarily got it right, which, you know, I deplore apartheid, just to try and clarify my point there so I don't dig myself into a hole.
Yeah, well, look, you see, apartheid was the wrong way of trying to deal with multiculturalism. The idea was that each of the constituent peoples of South Africa should have their own state where they would be able to progress to full independence, working together in a kind of confederation. But it was a crackpot idea from the first, because by that time the eggs had been thoroughly scrambled. There were no parts of South Africa in which whites were in a majority, and this was a policy that the vast majority of black South Africans didn't want. Now, that wasn't the right way to approach the question of multiculturalism. The challenge for communities is not how different communities should live apart. It is how they should be able to live together. And countries like Canada have really made a great deal of progress in promoting healthy multiculturalism.
Yeah, I think your comments are spot on there. And what can other countries around the world learn from South Africa's experiences since 1994 and the end of apartheid and / minority rule?
Well, I think that the main thing that countries around the world can learn from our experience is that even the most intractable political and social problems can be solved through negotiation and common sense. And that, I think, is what we have contributed to the world since, let's say, 1990. Secondly, I think what we can show other countries around the world is the importance of constitutionalism, having a sound constitution and a society subject to the rule of law rather than to the whim of the majority. The third lesson we can show the world is yet to be proved, and that is that we can make a success of such a society. But we are confident that we will be able to do so.
All right, and just before we wrap up here, I've just got one question, and this is just from my purely own personal point of view, but how big a part does economics or just basic day-to-day business transactions play in creating a multicultural society? So say you have people from two different cultural backgrounds in South Africa, and one's the customer in the local store and one's the guy behind the checkout. That's sort of a bit of bonding there, for lack of a better description.
Yeah, I think that there's a growing understanding that if you really want to break through to new markets, it helps a lot to understand the cultural environment of the people that you're trying to sell to and to treat them with respect and dignity within the framework of their culture.
All right, then just before we wrap up, is there anything you'd like to add? And thank you very much for joining us, Dave.
No, it's a great pleasure, and anytime you would like a wrap-up of what's happening in South Africa, please feel free to call.
Oh, I would absolutely love to hear from you again.
Great.
You have been listening to The Lens of History with Luke Herbert.